G'day, mate. Or should I say, good evening. You've just tuned into a place where the past refuses to stay buried. Tonight, I invite you to lean back, rest your eyes, and let the stories of stone walls, iron bars, and ghostly footsteps guide you into the unknown. The wind whispers through the ruins of Australia's oldest prisons, carrying the sighs of convicts, the footsteps of jailers, and cries that echo long after the doors were locked for the last time. This is not just a story of cells and chains. It's about those who lived, suffered, and sometimes never left. Before we begin, if you enjoy true tales, chilling legends, and journeys into the eerie corners of history, go ahead and tap like and subscribe. That way you'll always have a story waiting for you before bed. Now close your eyes if you wish and listen carefully. Somewhere in the dark, someone's still walking the halls. Let's begin. Port Arthur's lingering shadows. Nestled on the windswept Tasman Peninsula in southern Tasmania lies a place where the line between history and haunting blurs like mist over cold stone. Port Arthur. A name etched deeply into the annals of Australia's colonial past and into the bones of those who hear its stories whispered through the trees. Built in the year 1830 by convict labor, Port Arthur was more than a penal settlement. It was designed to break the spirit as well as the body. For those sent here, often for crimes as petty as stealing a loaf of bread, there was no redemption, only relentless punishment and isolation. The British Empire, determined to reform through fear, created a model prison complex with over 30 buildings, a separate prison for solitary confinement, a church, a hospital, and even an asylum. But even in its grandeur, Port Arthur bore a cruel heart. From the start, the place breathed suffering. Chains rattled, lashes cracked, and moans echoed down sandstone corridors. The separate prison, modeled on the silent system, was the worst of all. Here, inmates were kept in total silence, wearing masks to prevent recognition, and forced to exercise in individual yards shaped like coffins. Some men, already teetering on the edge, were driven to madness. And madness, as Port Arthur would teach, doesn't always end with death. One such soul was Henry Saville, a petty thief turned reoffender who arrived in Port Arthur in the winter of 1851. He was caught muttering to himself in the isolation cells, repeating the words, "I am not alone. He's watching me." Though dismissed at the time as the babble of a broken man, Saville's tale would become the first of many unexplainable events recorded in the settlement's dark history. Guards would later admit to hearing soft footsteps trailing them in the dark. Doors, firmly locked, would creak open slowly in the middle of the night. And more than once, a cold hand was felt resting on a shoulder when no one else was in the room. The ruins of Port Arthur today stand eerily silent, yet alive with the past. Tourists come in droves, drawn by the haunting beauty of moss-covered walls and the persistent feeling of being watched. Many report hearing whispers in the wind, particularly around the separate prison and the church, where the voices seem to rise and fall like distant hymns. Some even claim to have seen shadows moving between cell doorways, disappearing the moment they're looked at directly. Then there's the story of Eliza, a young girl, no older than 12, seen skipping through the corridors of the old hospital by multiple witnesses, all describing the same white dress, the same pale expression, and the same sudden vanish into thin air. Historians say no children were imprisoned at Port Arthur's main facility, but nearby, the Point Poor Boys Prison held young offenders as young as 9. It's believed Eliza may be the ghost of a staff member's child who fell from the upper floor of the hospital in the mid-19th century, but no official record confirms this. The Reverend George Eastman, who served the Anglican chapel in the 1860s, kept a diary in which he detailed several encounters that disturbed his faith. He once wrote, "I entered the chapel at dusk and felt a weight in the air, as if the Lord himself had turned his face from this place. A presence walked behind me, though I was alone. I heard the prayers of men long dead." Modern ghost tours often begin at this very church, now a skeletal ruin with Gothic windows and weathered brick towers. Guides tell guests to pay attention to the bells, for sometimes they ring without rope or wind. Skeptics chalk it up to wildlife or the mind's eagerness to believe, but not all can explain the photographs that emerge from these visits. In one image taken in the year 2008, a face, pale, contorted, and distinctly human, appears in the window of the penitentiary block. No one was inside at the time. And then there is the Island Cemetery.
Isle of the Dead, just across the water from Port Arthur, is the final resting place of over 1,000 souls, both free men and convicts. Buried with little ceremony, many lie in unmarked graves. Visitors speak of an oppressive air, as though grief itself never lifted from the soil. One account tells of a couple who visited in spring. The woman, who had no knowledge of the site's history, was struck by sudden nausea near a gnarled gum tree. She later dreamed of drowning, a detail she found odd until a guide revealed that near the very spot, a convict named Thomas Reddick had taken his own life by leaping into the sea from the rocks below. The staff at Port Arthur Historic Site, while professional and polite, do not dismiss these tales. Some even admit to experiencing odd events during night patrols, radios crackling with ghostly voices, lights switching on and off, and shadows that walk just out of reach. But perhaps the most unsettling detail is that the hauntings have not faded with time. In fact, many believe they've grown stronger. Since the tragic mass shooting in the year 1996, in which 35 lives were taken at the site, the air has grown even heavier. A sorrow now clings to the land like fog. Psychics and spiritualists claim that the grief of the past has mingled with the tragedy of the present, opening a deeper wound in the land itself. Whether you believe in spirits or not, Port Arthur commands respect. It is a place of history, sorrow, and silence, a silence filled with echoes. So next time you walk among its ruins, pause, listen. You may hear more than the birds or the sea breeze. You may hear the past, reaching out.
Fremantle Prison's Echoes of Despair. Rising from the limestone of Western Australia's coast like a monument to suffering, Fremantle Prison is a place where the past breathes through stone and steel. Built by the very hands it was designed to confine, this imposing structure has stood since the year 1855, etched into the fabric of Fremantle's identity. Yet beneath the heritage-listed exterior lies a maze of misery, defiance, and something far less earthly: the lingering voices of those who never truly left. Fremantle Prison began as the convict establishment constructed by British convicts shipped across oceans to a strange, sunburnt land. These men quarried the limestone, laid the bricks, and built their own prison walls. And in doing so, many sealed their fate within them. From its earliest days, the prison was known for its harsh regime: floggings, dark punishment cells, and isolation that gnawed at sanity. As the decades rolled on, the prison housed not only colonial convicts, but hardened criminals, political prisoners, and bushrangers. By the early 20th century, it had become the state's primary maximum security facility, a place of hangings, riots, escapes, and slow-burning despair. But beyond the historical records, something else persisted. Something that even the toughest wardens found hard to explain. One of the most commonly reported hauntings centers around Division 1, home to death row and the gallows. It was here that 44 men and 1 woman were executed between the years 1888 and 1964. Their final moments took place in a narrow, claustrophobic room with worn wooden floorboards, iron restraints, and a drop long enough to break both neck and spirit. Staff have reported sudden chills in the gallows room, even on the hottest of summer days. One guard recalled hearing a rope swinging when there was no breeze, no one near. Another refused to enter alone after seeing a shadow figure cross the threshold, only to vanish mid-stride. Many visitors claim to feel an overwhelming sense of dread at the foot of the scaffold, as if invisible eyes bore into them with quiet fury. And then there is Martha Rendell. The only woman ever hanged at Fremantle, Martha was convicted in the year 1910 of murdering her de facto husband's children using hydrochloric acid. Her case remains controversial, with claims that she was judged more harshly due to her gender and social standing. But whatever the truth, her presence is said to linger. Tour guides and tourists alike speak of a woman's laughter echoing through the prison corridors late at night, a sound that chills the spine. One visitor on a night tour reported seeing a pale face staring from the window of the chapel. When asked to describe it, she said, "It looked like a woman, smiling, but not kindly, like she knew something I didn't." Prison guides know the chapel well. Built to offer solace and redemption, it seems instead to radiate unease. The crucifix, carved by a prisoner in the 19th century, casts long shadows during candlelit tours. Some claim the eyes of Christ in the stained glass follow them as they move. A few have even said they heard prayers whispered in the silence, prayers not in English, but in Old Irish or Welsh, languages spoken by many of the early convicts. Beneath the prison lies a different kind of darkness, the tunnels.
Dug out by hand in the mid-19th century to access underground water supplies, the labyrinthine tunnel system stretches beneath the prison yard. Today, tourists can explore them by boat or on foot, donning helmets and boots. But some return shaken, not by claustrophobia, but by what they felt or heard. One guide, a skeptic by nature, once refused to return after an experience he described simply as being watched by something old. He reported a low humming sound that echoed without a source and a child's voice calling Papa in the pitch black. There were no children on that tour.
Paranormal investigators have conducted overnight vigils in these tunnels, using thermal cameras, EMF detectors, and audio recorders. While much can be dismissed as environmental noise, some recordings have captured clear, urgent whispers, "Get out," and "Help me," being the most disturbing.
One of the most compelling legends comes from the punishment cells. Dark, airless rooms where men were left for days without light, food, or even space to stand fully. Prisoner records describe hallucinations, breakdowns, and madness taking root within hours. Today, even in their disused state, these cells evoke intense discomfort. Visitors report dizziness, sudden nausea, and a crushing sense of despair. Psychics have claimed the cells are echo chambers of anguish, absorbing the energy of countless tormented souls. And perhaps the strangest tale of all is the hooded man. Spotted by both staff and visitors, this figure is described as tall, dressed in the black hood and cloak of an executioner. He walks the hallways at dusk, disappears around corners, and sometimes stands perfectly still at the ends of cell blocks, as if waiting for someone. No such uniform was ever officially worn at Fremantle, yet the reports are consistent and span decades. One guard in the 1970s resigned after encountering the figure 3 nights in a row, always in the same spot, outside the condemned cell. After 136 years of continuous use, Fremantle Prison finally closed in the year 1991. But the stories didn't stop. If anything, they intensified. Staff working on restoration projects began to speak of tools going missing, radios switching on by themselves, and heavy footsteps echoing in locked buildings. Today, Fremantle Prison is a World Heritage Site and one of the most visited landmarks in Western Australia. It hosts educational tours, art exhibitions, and even live music. But beneath the cultural celebration lies a sobering truth, that buildings made to crush the human spirit often hold on to that pain. Some say spirits remain when they have unfinished business. Others believe some places simply absorb what they're exposed to, and nothing absorbs like limestone. So if you visit Fremantle, Take the tour, learn the stories, walk the halls where thousands once lived, wept, and perished. But when you stand in the gallows room or pass by a flickering light in Division 1, listen closely. The prison may be closed, but it still remembers.
The screams beneath old Melbourne Jail. In the heart of Melbourne, where the city pulses with the rhythm of laneway cafes and neon nightlife, there lies a grim sentinel of a harsher era. Looming behind high blue stone walls, old Melbourne Jail is not just a relic of the colonial past, it is a monument to execution, endurance, and a chill that clings to the marrow of anyone who steps inside. From the moment you cross its heavy threshold, you're met not with silence, but with an oppressive stillness, the kind that comes only from centuries of suffering. Constructed in stages between the years 1842 and 1864, Old Melbourne Jail was built to be the last stop for Victoria's worst. Men, women, and even children were held here under a regime of Victorian morality and cold justice. It was here that Ned Kelly, Australia's most infamous bushranger, was executed by hanging in the year 1880. His death mask, a grim plaster cast of his face made hours after his execution, still rests behind glass, eyes forever closed, yet never at peace. The jail housed over 130 hangings during its time. The gallows are still intact, and the rope used in those executions remains one of the most tangible links to death in the building. Visitors report an intense, suffocating pressure in the execution wing, a weight that presses against the chest as if the room itself is gasping. Some say they feel faint, others weep without knowing why. Paranormal investigators have labeled this space one of the most active in all of Victoria, and the stories begin almost immediately. The most well-known spectre in the jail is simply called the Screamer. Described by visitors and staff alike as a female presence, her cries echo through the night, most often heard near the women's cells on the upper floors. Inmates in the 19th century told of a young woman unjustly accused of infanticide who clawed at the stone walls and sobbed until the morning of her hanging. Some claim to still hear her fingernails scraping the iron door. Others hear the frantic footsteps of a barefoot woman running the corridor in terror. The cells where she once lived are now part of the museum, but the atmosphere remains heavy with dread. And then there is Ned Kelly. Though his ghost is not seen as often as it is sensed, many report an overwhelming sadness when standing near his cell. Some feel a presence behind them, as though someone is watching closely, not with menace, but with weariness. One tour guide recounted a time when a school group entered Kelly's wing, and a boy, no older than 12, turned pale and whispered, "He's sad. He doesn't want to be here." The boy had no prior knowledge of Kelly's life or death. Historians often debate whether Ned Kelly was a folk hero or a cold-blooded killer, but the energy he left behind is undeniable. The very gallows that took his life were later removed, then restored as part of the museum. Since then, several visitors have fainted upon standing beneath the noose. One young man claimed to feel a jolt in his neck, as if a rope had been suddenly pulled tight. Medical staff found no physical cause. The children's ward, a chilling concept in itself, once held boys as young as 10. Convicted of theft, truancy, or worse, they were kept in cells, not unlike those of adult murderers. Today, the ward is cold, with rusted bars and worn bedding displays. It is also where staff refuse to linger after dark. Visitors have reported the sound of marbles rolling across the floor, soft giggles that stop the moment they are acknowledged, and the sensation of small hands brushing against their legs. And what of the death masks?
Old Melbourne Jail holds one of the world's largest collections of death masks, plaster molds taken from the faces of the executed. Intended for phrenological study, these masks were once thought to offer insight into criminal psychology through the shape of a person's skull. But today, they evoke something far more primal. The expressions are serene, sometimes peaceful, yet almost always unnerving. It is said that standing before them too long brings on headaches or a sense of being watched. One visitor claimed a mask smiled at her when no one else was around. Another found her phone camera refused to work within the display area, only to suddenly snap dozens of blurred photos when she stepped away, most showing a faint, distorted figure behind her shoulder. Security staff have their own stories. One veteran guard swore he saw a man in 19th century prison garb walking the lower corridor at 2 in the morning. Assuming it was a costumed trespasser, he followed him, only to find the corridor empty and the doors still locked. He resigned the following month. Perhaps the most disturbing tale involves a recent exhibition staff member who was closing up late one evening. Alone in the building, she began to switch off lights when she heard footsteps behind her. Slow, deliberate, heavy boots. Turning, she found no one. She continued, a bit shaken, until a loud bang echoed through the corridor. She fled the building and later found one of the cell doors, normally sealed shut, was hanging wide open. She never returned. Even the stone itself seems to remember. The prison was constructed with local bluestone, quarried and hauled by convicts. Many believe this stone absorbs trauma, holding on to the pain of those confined within it. Psychics and energy sensitives describe the walls as weeping or bleeding sorrow, particularly in the cells where multiple men were held in rotation before facing the noose. During a thunderstorm in the early 2000s, lightning struck a power line connected to the jail, plunging the museum into darkness during a night tour. Emergency lights flickered as guests huddled in the central hall. According to several witnesses, a silhouette appeared in the execution wing, unmoving, featureless, and faintly glowing. When lights were restored minutes later, nothing remained. Old Melbourne Jail is now a museum, yes, but it is also a mausoleum, a vessel of memory. So if you find yourself there, walking beneath the towering bluestone arches, listen to your instincts. Stay close to the group. Avoid the temptation to stray into quiet corners or peer too long into the eyes of a death mask, because some stories are still being written.
Boggo Road Jail's Phantom Inmates. Just south of the Brisbane River, in the suburb of Dutton Park, rises a weathered red brick fortress once known as the most notorious prison in Queensland. Boggo Road Jail, a name that echoes through the state's darker history, is more than a crumbling relic of justice past. It is a place where the walls whisper, and the spirits of the condemned are said to prowl the shadows long after the final cell door was slammed shut. Opened in the year 1883 as Brisbane Prison, Boggo Road quickly earned a reputation for overcrowding, brutality, and decay. The name Boggo itself, according to local legend, referred to the boggy terrain on which the prison was built. Soft, shifting ground that clung to boots and spirits alike. But by the early 20th century, it had come to mean something else entirely. Fear. The No. 2 Division, the section that remains standing today, was reserved for male inmates and saw generations of criminals, from petty thieves to murderers, pass through its iron gates. It was a place where sentences were long, tempers were short, and the heat of Queensland's summers turned the cells into ovens of sweat and anguish. The punishment cells were infamous. Buried deep within the jail, these isolation rooms were kept dark, humid, and devoid of human contact. Men were placed there for weeks at a time, left to rot with their thoughts and the rats. It's said that the screams from those cells could be heard echoing across the yard long into the night. And today, even with no prisoners inside, those screams continue. One of the most persistent hauntings is that of Slim Halliday, the Houdini of Boggo Road. Convicted of murder in the mid-20th century, Halliday gained fame for his daring escape attempts. He broke out not once, but twice, evading police for weeks before being recaptured. Though he always claimed innocence in the murder charge, he spent many years in solitary confinement for his constant defiance. Slim died in the year 1971, but many believe he never really left. Guides report hearing heavy breathing in his former cell, and visitors sometimes feel as though someone is brushing past them in the corridor nearby. One security guard, while locking up after a night tour, reported hearing the distinctive sound of boots pacing back and forth in Cell 1, Halliday's old cell. When he unlocked the door, the room was empty, but still warm. There is also the tale of the Red Lady, a mysterious female figure seen in the main wing. Her presence is puzzling, as the No. 2 Division never officially housed women. Witnesses describe her as tall, dressed in a crimson dress, with a face obscured by shadow. She appears most often on the upper balconies, looking down into the yard as though searching for someone. A former prison officer claimed she once turned to face him directly, though she had no eyes, only sockets that seemed to bleed darkness.
Speculation abounds about who she might have been. Some believe she was a staff member or nurse from a time when the jail briefly held both men and women. Others think she is the spirit of a woman who died nearby, drawn into the prison by grief. Whatever her story, those who see her never forget. Executions were carried out at Boggo Road by hanging, though fewer than at other prisons. The final execution took place in the year 1914, that of Ernest Austin, a convicted child murderer. His ghost is said to be the most active of all. Austin was the last man ever hanged in Queensland. Legend has it that in the hours leading up to his death, he laughed maniacally, claiming that his real punishment would begin after death. Prisoners later reported seeing his ghost walking the upper tiers, chuckling to himself. Guards refused to patrol alone, and some claimed to have seen his shadow darting from cell to cell, always just out of sight. Even decades later, stories of Austin's presence persist. During a historical tour in the early 2000s, a guide stopped suddenly mid-sentence, staring at the stairwell. When asked what was wrong, she said, "He's just gone past," laughing. The group thought she was playing along until the youngest guest began to cry, saying he heard someone whisper in his ear, "It's not over yet." Boggo Road Jail was officially decommissioned in the year 1989. By then, its reputation for inhumane conditions had reached a boiling point. Prison riots, hunger strikes, and media exposés painted a picture of a place more medieval than modern. But as the final prisoners were transferred and the cells fell silent, strange things began to stir. The site, now used for guided tours and historical exhibitions, has become a hotspot for paranormal researchers. Thermal imaging has picked up unexplained heat signatures in empty cells. EMF meters spike in locations with no wiring. Voices are captured on recorders, whispering names or muttering curses. One investigator claimed to feel something grip his wrist with such force it left bruises, though no one else was in the room. And then there are the unexplained smells. Visitors have reported the scent of pipe tobacco lingering in Cell 12, a place no one is allowed to smoke. Others speak of sudden bursts of rotting meat, bleach, or blood, smells that come and go without warning. A former warden once said, "The jail talks to you, not with words, but with memories soaked into the walls." Indeed, the very architecture seems to hold the past like a sponge. The flaking paint, the rusting bars, the etched graffiti of long-dead inmates, all of it contributes to an atmosphere thick with sorrow, anger, and regret. It's no surprise that night tours are conducted with caution. Tourists are advised to stay close, not because of safety concerns, but because isolation can do strange things in a place like Boggo Road. One woman strayed from the group for only a minute. When she rejoined them, her hands were shaking, and she whispered, "He said I shouldn't be here." She never clarified who he was. Perhaps the most unnerving detail of all is that these hauntings are not confined to dark corners or dramatic cell blocks. Even in broad daylight, the jail holds its secrets close, sometimes releasing them in a sudden gust of cold air, a creaking door, or a whisper on the wind. So if you walk the corridors of Boggo Road, keep your wits about you. Listen carefully, because the phantom inmates, like their flesh and blood predecessors, do not take kindly to being ignored.
Maitland Jail's Iron Whispers. Tucked away in New South Wales' Hunter Valley, far from the modern glint of Sydney's skyline, stands a behemoth of sandstone and iron. Maitland Jail. It is solid, hulking, immovable, as though the land itself rose up to cage those who walk too far outside the law. Operational for 150 years, Maitland was not just a prison. It was a machine built to crush defiance. And though it closed its gates in the year 1998, it still hums with the low, constant murmur of memory. And something else. Something watching. First opened in the year 1848, Maitland Jail housed some of Australia's most dangerous and recalcitrant criminals. From petty thieves in the gold rush days to high-profile gangsters in the late 20th century, the prison never rested. Its walls, 12 meters high and razor-topped, were not designed to keep prisoners in. They were meant to contain rage. The cells, narrow and suffocating, offered no privacy, no reprieve. And the guards? Hardened, unyielding, often brutal. But even in such a place, stories began to circulate. Not about the living, but the dead. They call it the Whistler, a spirit that roams the wings after dusk, announcing itself not with footfalls, but with a long, slow whistle, the kind prisoners use to signal danger or pass messages. Staff during the prison's final years reported hearing it during lockdown, a clear tune rising from empty blocks. One officer, veteran of over a decade's service, said he followed the sound to B Wing, only to find all cells sealed, all lights off, and the sound growing louder as he approached Cell 9. When he opened the door, there was nothing. Nothing but a sudden drop in temperature and a pressure in his chest that stayed with him for days. Maitland's B Wing has long been the center of its supernatural lore. It housed some of the most violent men in the country, many of whom spent years in solitary confinement. The energy there is thick. Even seasoned ghost hunters approach the block with caution. EMF readings spike for no discernible reason, batteries drain without warning, and strange flashes of light appear in photographs, often near the sealed cell where an inmate once took his own life using a shard of mirror. And then there's the execution yard. From 1861 to 1897, 16 men were hanged at Maitland Jail. The gallows were once situated in a corner of the exercise yard, now a patch of overgrown grass and crumbling stone. But the space still pulses with history. Visitors often describe it as wrong, not in shape or size, but in feeling. Birds do not land there, insects do not crawl, and more than one tourist has fallen suddenly ill while passing through.
It was here that William O'Meally, bushranger and convicted murderer, faced the noose. But according to some accounts, his death was not instant. The rope stretched, his legs twitched. His final breath, they say, was not a gasp, but a scream. Locals believe his soul remained tethered to that patch of earth. Some nights, if the wind is right, a voice can be heard crying out just before midnight, "I didn't do it." The guards' quarters, once a place of rest and administration, hold their own secrets. A former officer in the 1980s refused to stay overnight in the upper room. He spoke of waking to the sound of boots walking across the ceiling above a floor that had no access. Others reported objects being moved, radios turning on by themselves, and doors slamming with unnatural force. And yet, it's not just sound that haunts Maitland, it's sight. The apparition most commonly seen is that of a man in a prison-issue uniform, standing at the end of hallways, staring, always staring, He never moves, never speaks, but his presence is overwhelming. One psychic medium who toured the jail in the early 2000s said she was nearly knocked off her feet by his gaze, as though he were projecting guilt and fury through his very outline. She later identified his energy as that of a man who burned with injustice, whether real or imagined. But perhaps the most unnerving presence is found in the chapel. Originally constructed as a place for prisoners to repent and seek redemption, the chapel at Maitland Jail is now considered one of the most haunted parts of the site. Wooden pews sit crooked, worn thin by decades of restless shifting. The stained glass windows are cracked, yet they still throw eerie light across the floor when the sun hits just right. It was here, according to legend, that a priest collapsed mid-sermon in the 1880s, muttering something about black wings in the rafters. Since then, the chapel has hosted dozens of reports of flickering lights, disembodied whispers, and the overwhelming sensation of being judged. Some visitors claim they feel eyes watching from above, even though the rafters are now empty and exposed. One woman, during a daytime tour, fainted suddenly in the chapel's center. When she woke, she asked why the man in the collar had been yelling at her. There was no man, no collar, only her tour group, and the guide, who had been standing silently beside her the entire time. Today, Maitland Jail operates as a museum and events venue. School groups walk the same halls that once rang with howls and curses. The graffiti of long-dead inmates still mars the walls. Crude drawings, names, dates of confinement, sometimes prayers, sometimes threats. Ghost tours run year-round, drawing thrill-seekers and skeptics alike. Most leave with stories, whether of footsteps, whispers, or that feeling of dread just beneath the surface. Some leave in silence, their experiences too difficult to explain or too strange to share. And some do not finish the tour. Because in Maitland, history is not confined to dusty displays or yellowed documents. It lives in the air, in the rusted hinges of old cell doors, in the iron that groans when no one touches it. The jail does not sleep. It waits. It watches. So if you find yourself there after dark, listen for the whistle. It means you've been noticed.
The Dark Secrets of Trial Bay Jail. Along the windswept shores of New South Wales, where the restless Tasman Sea lashes against jagged rock and the salt air clings to your skin, stands the skeletal remains of a jail unlike any other. Trial Bay Jail, a place where the line between beauty and bleakness is razor thin. Perched atop a headland near Southwest Rocks, this prison was built to tame convicts and civilize wilderness. But what remains now is more than crumbling stone. It is a monument to isolation, betrayal, and the ghosts of war-torn minds. Construction began in the year 1877, with the jail envisioned as a public works facility, one that would house well-behaved prisoners tasked with building a breakwater to create a safe harbor for ships. It was a forward-thinking concept at the time, and unlike many other colonial prisons, Trial Bay was designed with windows, natural light, and ocean views. But what was meant to be progressive turned bitter quickly. The project was plagued with engineering failures, budget blowouts, and morale issues. By the year 1903, the prison was shut. But its most unsettling chapter had yet to begin. With the outbreak of the First World War, the jail was reactivated as an internment camp for German nationals, civilians and intellectuals considered enemy aliens. These were not soldiers. Many were doctors, musicians, professors, even artists. Men who had built lives in Australia only to find themselves locked behind the very walls meant to symbolize reform. The German internees brought culture and creativity with them. They formed orchestras, staged plays, painted murals on their cell walls, and even published a handwritten magazine. But for all their efforts to maintain dignity, something about the jail, its harsh sea winds, its unnatural quiet, began to gnaw at them. Fights broke out, paranoia took root, and then the deaths began. One of the most persistent spirits said to haunt Trial Bay is that of Dr. Ernst Müller, a German physician interned during the war. Known among his fellow inmates as a gentle soul and skilled violinist, Müller was found dead in his cell under suspicious circumstances in the year 1916. Officially, his death was listed as suicide, a claim many disputed. Some believed he was murdered during a disagreement over rations. Others whispered that he had learned something about the guards, or perhaps another inmate, that cost him his life. Today, visitors to Müller's former cell report hearing the faint strains of violin music drifting through the corridors when no one else is around. Some say the melody is mournful. Others say it grows violent, dissonant, if you linger too long. Paranormal investigators have captured audio recordings of what they believe to be strings being plucked, despite the absence of any instruments on the premises. But it is not only Müller who is said to remain.
The most feared presence in Trial Bay Jail is known as the Watcher. Described as tall, thin, and always seen in silhouette, the Watcher is most often spotted in the cell block's upper corridor, standing still, too still, near the window where light no longer reaches. He does not move, he does not speak, but those who see him report a feeling of suffocation, as if the air is suddenly too thick to breathe. One guide claimed that after seeing the Watcher, he developed insomnia for weeks, waking every night at exactly 3 o'clock, the same time the apparition appeared. Others describe more intimate encounters.
One woman, staying nearby in the caretaker's cottage, woke to the sound of whispering just outside her window. Thinking it was wind, she dismissed it. But when she rose to make tea, she saw footprints, barefoot, large, and unmistakably human, leading from the jail ruins to her door and then vanishing. She left the site the next morning and never returned. Another unexplained phenomenon lies in the prison chapel. Though time and weather have stripped the space bare, the outline of a cross remains etched into the wall. Visitors frequently report a strange heaviness here, accompanied by a sense of overwhelming guilt. Some have described hearing confession, soft voices murmuring in German, asking for forgiveness. One young tourist fainted upon entering, later claiming that someone had placed a hand on her shoulder and whispered her name, though she spoke no German and knew no one at the site. In the mess hall, once used by both convicts and internees, strange lights appear at night. Orbs, faint blue and white, hover for seconds before vanishing. Local volunteers restoring the area have noted tools disappearing, chairs being rearranged, and the sound of cutlery clinking, as if a long-forgotten supper is being served to guests no longer alive. Even the natural surroundings seem caught in the jail's spell.
Storms roll in fast over Trial Bay, lightning illuminating the ruins in stark, cinematic bursts. More than one visitor has claimed to see figures standing on the walls during these storms, men in old military coats staring out to sea. Some believe these are the spirits of internees who lost hope and cast themselves into the waves. Others insist they're the guards, still keeping watch. And then there is the beach. Just below the jail lies a stretch of sand where prisoners once walked under heavy guard. Today, locals say it is cursed. Dogs refuse to walk near it. Birds rarely fly overhead. And some mornings, footprints appear in the sand before the tide has turned. Wide, deliberate strides that lead to the water and stop. Trial Bay Jail closed its doors for good after the war. Its walls, battered by time and salt, now house silence and shadow. But the energy remains. Historians marvel at its dual identity, a place of enlightenment and incarceration, of culture and cruelty. Paranormal researchers, however, are more direct. They call it a beacon, a place where the veil is thin, where emotions run deep and ghosts do not rest. So if you ever find yourself standing within the ruins of Trial Bay Jail, take a moment, listen to the wind, watch the walls, and if you hear a violin's cry carried by the sea breeze, know this: someone is still waiting to be heard.
Parramatta, jail's forgotten Wails. In the ever-growing urban sprawl of Sydney's western suburbs lies a place almost swallowed by time, yet still throbbing with echoes of agony. Parramatta Jail, once a keystone of New South Wales's penal system, now stands eerily dormant behind high sandstone walls and rusting iron gates. But make no mistake, this prison is far from silent. Its corridors may no longer hold inmates, but they do not rest. The cries, whispers, and footsteps that once marked life within its walls have not faded. If anything, they have grown louder. First opened in the year 1842, Parramatta Jail was constructed atop the ruins of an even older penal stockade dating back to the early 1800s. That original site, little more than wooden walls and punishment posts, was notorious for its brutality. Whippings, starvation, and rampant disease were the norm. When the new jail rose in its place, its solid sandstone foundations were meant to symbolize control and civility. Instead, they trapped generations of despair. Over its 164 years of operation, Parramatta Jail housed some of Australia's most dangerous criminals, but also countless minor offenders, the mentally ill, and those who simply had nowhere else to go. It was, in every sense, a place of confinement not only for the body, but for the soul. One of the most chilling aspects of the jail's history lies in its use of isolation cells. Dark, cramped rooms with no natural light, soundproofed walls, and doors so heavy they took 2 men to open. It was in these cells that inmates were sent to break. Some emerged shattered, others never emerged at all. One such inmate was Matthew Quinn, a young man convicted of horse theft in the mid-19th century. Locked in isolation for repeated insubordination, he reportedly scratched prayers into the stone walls with his fingernails until they bled. When guards finally checked on him after 3 days of silence, they found him unresponsive, huddled in the corner, whispering over and over, "She's in the wall. She's in the wall." Quinn later died in the infirmary. His cell has been sealed ever since. Modern visitors standing outside often report a sharp drop in temperature and the sound of muffled scratching, like fingernails on stone. The jail's most infamous wing, known simply as Block C, housed the long-term inmates, many of whom were never expected to rejoin society. The block was feared even by staff. Stories persist of phantom footsteps pacing the upper tier long after lights out, and of a shadowy figure seen darting from one end of the block to the other. This figure, described as tall, featureless, and always just out of reach, has become known among tour guides as the Runner. Attempts to photograph him have resulted in blurry streaks or complete camera failure, but the most disturbing stories come not from staff or tourists, but from former inmates. One man, now a respected academic, spent 6 years at Parramatta in the 1980s for drug-related offenses. He later recounted in an interview that during his 2nd year, he began hearing a woman's voice in the yard at night, low, mournful, and singing in an unfamiliar language. The voice always came from the same corner, near an old tree that no longer stands. When he asked the guards about it, they dismissed him. But one older inmate whispered, "That's just Mary. She's been here longer than all of us." Research into the site revealed a dark piece of history. The jail was built near the grounds of the Parramatta Female Factory, a place of forced labor and hardship for thousands of women in the early colonial period. Many of those women died there, unmarked and forgotten. It is believed some of their remains lie beneath what later became the men's exercise yard. The voice, some say, belongs to one of them. Another unsettling feature of Parramatta Jail is its chapel. Designed in a Gothic style with narrow windows and a vaulted ceiling, the chapel was meant to offer hope. Instead, it became a place of dread. Several inmates refused to enter it, claiming that a man in black robes stood near the pulpit, watching. One prisoner claimed the figure whispered prayers backwards. Others spoke of a presence sitting in the back pew, always silent, always facing the door. Tour staff have since corroborated sightings of this figure. One described feeling a hand pressed gently on his shoulder while cleaning the chapel alone. Turning quickly, he saw no one, but the pressure remained for several minutes, cold and heavy. The infirmary holds its own secrets. During its final decades, the medical wing served not only the sick and injured, but also those battling psychological distress. Nurses reported hearing sobbing from empty rooms, and once found a metal bed frame violently shaking with no explanation. One mental health officer, working late in the 1990s, was drawn to a room by the sound of crying. When she entered, the lights cut out. In the dark, she heard a voice whisper, "You shouldn't be here. They don't like it." She never returned to work. The jail closed in the year 2001. Since then, it has undergone various proposals for redevelopment, from art centers to housing, but all have stalled. Locals say the land rejects modernity, that the spirits of the past are not yet done speaking. Some construction workers assigned to preliminary restoration work in the early 2000s left the site after tools vanished, scaffolding collapsed without wind, and voices were heard echoing through locked cell blocks. But perhaps the most enduring mystery is the jail's final prisoner.
Records indicate that the last inmate was transferred out in early September 2001, but multiple staff members claim they saw another man, tall, gaunt, with pale skin and long hair, still walking the upper corridors the day after the transfer. He wore no uniform, spoke to no one, and vanished when followed. His presence has never been explained. Today, Parramatta Jail stands in limbo, too haunted to be repurposed, too significant to be forgotten. The building may be empty, but it is never still. If you stand quietly near the gates at night, you might hear it. A distant clang, a low moan, or a whisper on the wind. They're still there, the ones they left behind, and they're waiting to be heard.
The Watcher of Adelaide Jail. In the heart of South Australia's capital, just a short walk from the city centre, lies one of the oldest public buildings in the state, Adelaide Jail. At first glance, it seems deceptively quiet. Encased in thick stone walls and framed by well-kept lawns and flower beds, it might pass for a stately colonial relic. But step through its wrought iron gates after dark, and you will feel it. That sudden drop in temperature, that creeping sense of being observed. For inside these walls, something, or someone, is still watching. Constructed between the years 1841 and 1843, Adelaide Jail was one of the first permanent prisons in South Australia. Its design, based on British penal architecture, was austere and functional, meant to hold up to 140 prisoners, a number that was quickly exceeded as the colony expanded. Over its 147 years of operation, more than 300,000 prisoners passed through its gates, and 45 of them died within the prison walls. 11 were executed by hanging, their bodies buried in unmarked graves within the grounds. Yet death, it seems, did not always bring rest. The most unsettling entity associated with Adelaide Jail is known simply as the Watcher. Tall, dark, and cloaked in what appears to be an old-style prison guard's uniform, the Watcher has been sighted countless times since the jail closed in the year 1988. Most appearances occur in the eastern wing, particularly near the cells once used for solitary confinement. Tour guides describe a shadowy figure who lingers at the far end of the corridor, just beyond the reach of torchlight. He does not move. He does not speak. He just watches. One guide, who has led tours for over a decade, refuses to enter the solitary cells alone. She recounts a moment during a quiet afternoon tour when, turning to speak to a visitor, she saw the figure standing behind the group, motionless, arms folded, eyes fixed straight ahead. When she blinked, he was gone. Several guests saw him too. One woman fainted. Another fled the site entirely, refusing to ever return. What makes the Watcher so frightening isn't his appearance, but his energy. Those who come near his usual haunts describe a suffocating presence, as if their very thoughts are being read. Psychics brought to the site independently have described the same sensation. "He's not human," one said. Or rather, he was. But he's become something else, something bound to the act of watching. And the Watcher is not alone. In the old women's wing, visitors report the scent of lavender, strong, sudden, and entirely out of place in the jail's musty corridors. This is often accompanied by the faint sound of weeping. Some say it's the ghost of Elizabeth Woolcock, the only woman ever executed in South Australia. Convicted of poisoning her abusive husband in the year 1873, Elizabeth maintained her innocence until the moment of her death. She was 25 years old.
Elizabeth's ghost, unlike the Watcher, is not feared. Many feel sadness rather than dread in her presence. Her cell, Cell 21, remains one of the most visited areas of the jail. Flowers are sometimes left at her door, and tour guests often report an urge to weep when standing inside, even if they've never heard her story before. But not all spirits in Adelaide jail are so gentle. There is the sound of dragging chains in the execution yard, despite the fact that all shackles were removed decades ago. Late-night staff have reported doors slamming shut without wind and voices rising from empty cells. One volunteer, helping restore a section of the western wing, fled the site after hearing someone whisper his name 3 times. He was alone at the time. He has not spoken of it since. Perhaps the most bizarre incident occurred in the early 2000s, when a paranormal research group was given after-hours access to the jail. Using thermal cameras and sound equipment, they attempted to document unexplained activity. Around midnight, one member captured footage of a temperature anomaly, a humanoid shape standing just outside the chapel. When they approached, the shape vanished, and every device in their kit suddenly lost power. Reviewing the footage later, they found that the figure had been moving, not walking, but gliding. The chapel itself has its own legend. It is said that a priest once went mad while preparing a sermon in the late 19th century, scratching incomprehensible symbols into the wooden floor before being removed by guards. That same floor, now polished and roped off, sometimes bears faint outlines of markings, no matter how often they are scrubbed clean. Visitors standing near the pulpit have reported pressure on their chests, difficulty breathing, and a sensation of something looming above them. One local man, visiting with his daughter during an open day, was found seated on the chapel bench in tears. When asked what had happened, he replied simply, "He showed me what he did. I don't want to know that." Outside, the burial yard is unmarked. 11 men lie beneath the soil, their names recorded in the jail's dusty archives, but their final resting places lost to time. Staff report strange fogs forming over the yard, even on dry summer nights. Dogs brought to the site refuse to step beyond the gate, and some guests speak of seeing lights, small, white, floating orbs, drifting just above the ground before vanishing. Yet, it always returns to the Watcher. His presence is the jail's spine, cold, rigid, and ever-present. One theory suggests he may have been a particularly cruel warden, one who delighted in the suffering of those under his charge. Others believe he is a former inmate, driven mad by isolation, who now roams the corridors in a grotesque echo of authority. But those who have felt his gaze, that piercing, heavy gaze, all say the same thing. He is still waiting. Adelaide Jail today serves as a museum, a wedding venue, and even a location for film shoots. But behind the heritage grants and daytime tours, the energy remains, thick, unsettling, watching. So if you visit and find yourself alone in a corridor and feel the air go still, do not turn too quickly, because the watcher is always watching, and sometimes he wants you to see him too.
Norfolk Island's cursed convict Cries. Far beyond the Australian mainland, deep in the Pacific Ocean, lies a place cloaked in mists, waves, and whispering winds. A place where exile meant oblivion. Norfolk Island, just over 1,000 kilometers northeast of Sydney, is today known for its scenic beauty and peaceful isolation. But behind the swaying pines and emerald hills lies a history soaked in cruelty, despair, and ghostly cries that still echo across its shores. Norfolk Island was first established as a penal colony in the year 1788, mere months after the founding of Sydney. Intended as a remote outpost for the worst of the worst, repeat offenders, mutineers, and troublemakers, the island became synonymous with punishment. Its isolation was its weapon. If you were sent to Norfolk Island, you weren't just removed from society. You were erased from it. The first penal settlement was abandoned in the early 19th century, but by the year 1825, the British returned, this time with a clear objective: to create a living hell. The island's second penal era is infamous. Men were flogged until flesh fell away from bone. They starved, worked to collapse, and were sometimes executed without trial. The commandants ruled with near absolute power, and under some, most notoriously Major Joseph Childs, Norfolk became a nightmare made real, and nightmares, it seems, never truly die. Today, the ruins of the convict settlement in Kingston are beautifully preserved, too beautiful, perhaps, for the horrors they contain. Tourists wander through the crumbling stone of the old barracks, the jailhouse, and the gallows site. They take photos, marvel at the history, and often find their joy short-lived. One of the most frequently reported phenomena is the sound of men weeping, not shouting, not moaning, weeping. Deep, broken sobs, usually heard near the solitary cells in the old jail. Visitors describe the sound as unbearably human, too real to dismiss. Some have even followed it, only to find themselves utterly alone, the sound evaporating the moment they turn a corner. The solitary cells themselves are chilling. Hewn into the earth, some still retain their original wooden doors, warped by salt and time. One particular cell, Cell 8, is known to cause nausea and panic attacks. Tour guides joke nervously about the bad vibes, but many refuse to enter it at all. A local maintenance worker reported feeling a hand close tightly around his neck while repairing a roof beam just above it. He fell from the ladder and never returned to the site.
Then there's the ghost of William Westwood, known as Jackie, a bushranger turned reformist and later rebel leader. Westwood was hanged in the year 1846 after leading a violent uprising against the brutal conditions on the island. His story is tragic. Once a highwayman, he tried to speak out for fellow inmates and was ultimately silenced with a noose. His execution site still stands within the compound. Visitors standing near the hanging tree often feel sudden vertigo, as if the world tilts beneath their feet. One woman fainted upon hearing a whispered voice in her ear. They knew. Another reported a hand on her back, pushing lightly, even though no one stood near. The gallows themselves, though long dismantled, have left a psychic scar. Tourists describe hearing the creak of rope, the snap of wood, and in one case, the final prayer of a man in broken Gaelic. No such reenactments are staged on the site. What people hear comes from something older. But the haunting of Norfolk Island is not limited to the prison complex. Government House, overlooking the sea, is said to be home to a different kind of ghost, one of sadness and duty. Multiple witnesses have seen the figure of a woman in Victorian dress standing on the veranda, looking out toward the ocean. She does not move. She simply waits. Locals believe she is the spirit of a warden's wife, left alone on the island after her husband perished during a storm. Her story is largely unrecorded, but the sightings, consistent in detail and timing, have persisted for over a century. The cemetery, one of the oldest in Australia, is another centre of activity. Graves from the early convict era dot the hillside, many marked with crumbling headstones or left unmarked entirely. Visitors report cold gusts of wind that follow them up the slope, even on windless days. Flowers placed on graves are sometimes found shredded or moved hours later, even in locked enclosures. One chilling event was recorded by a photography student in the late 1990s. Attempting to capture the soft sunset over the cemetery, he took a series of timed exposures on film. When developed, one frame showed a group of 4 men, shirtless, shackled at the neck, staring directly at the camera. No tour groups had been present at the time. The image was analyzed by multiple sources and remains unexplained. And what of the sea? Norfolk Island's shoreline is rugged and treacherous, and during the penal years, any attempt to escape by boat meant certain death. Legend has it that some still try. Fishermen have reported seeing a lone figure wading into the waves at twilight, vanishing before reaching the surf. One crew swore they saw a raft, crude, made of branches, floating near Slaughter Bay. It disappeared before they could reach it. The locals speak softly about the convict wind, a sudden breeze that cuts through the warmth and carries the scent of sweat, blood, and salt. It moves in silence, striking without warning, and always from the direction of the ruins. Norfolk Island today is a tourist destination, rich in Polynesian history and cultural charm. But for those who pause, those who listen, the past seeps through. The cries of the condemned, the sorrow of the forgotten, the injustice carved into stone, they live on. So if you ever walk the ruins at dusk and feel the urge to look behind you, do. Because someone may be walking the same path, bound in chains, unseen, but never truly gone.
Goulburn Jail's Ghost of Retribution. Set against the rolling hills of southern New South Wales, Goulburn Correctional Centre, known more chillingly as Goulburn Jail, is a place where legends fester behind razor wire, and silence has teeth. It is one of the oldest functioning prisons in Australia, and arguably the most infamous. A towering reminder of punishment past and present, Goulburn's walls are as much a psychological barrier as they are physical. And within those walls, stories are whispered that never make the evening news. Goulburn Jail first opened its gates in the year 1884. Built in a style that mimicked medieval fortresses, the sandstone walls stretch nearly 7 meters high, crowned with battlements and flanked by narrow windows like the eyes of a beast. Inside, the cells are grim and unyielding, designed for discipline rather than comfort. Over the decades, the jail has held everyone from petty thieves to mass murderers. But it is not only the living who draw attention here, because some inmates, they say, never left. One story above all has stood the test of time within the prison's whispered folklore, that of the ghost of Retribution, a spirit that is said to stalk the corridors of Goulburn in search of vengeance, justice, or something even darker. According to long-serving officers, the ghost first made its presence known in the early 20th century, after a particularly brutal execution in the prison's gallows yard. The inmate, known only by his initials, RM, had been convicted of murdering another prisoner in cold blood. He never spoke a word during his trial and was hanged without ceremony on a gray, mist-laden morning. Just before the drop, he reportedly turned to the chaplain and said, "I'll come for the ones who deserve it." In the weeks that followed, strange events began to plague the prison. Guards reported hearing heavy footsteps outside their office windows, despite being on the 3rd floor. Lights flickered violently in the solitary block, even when the power was off. One young warden fled his post after encountering what he described as a man-shaped shadow with no face, standing silently at the end of the corridor. Soon, a pattern began to emerge. Every time an inmate or officer committed an act of cruelty, a beating, a cover-up, a malicious punishment, they were visited. Not during daylight, and not in ways that could be easily explained. They'd hear their names whispered in the dark, feel a hand wrap around their ankle in the middle of the night, or wake with bruises they could not explain. One such case occurred in the 1950s when a notoriously violent guard, referred to in reports only as Sergeant L, was found unconscious in cell block B with 3 broken fingers and a fractured rib. No inmates were nearby. No struggle was heard. When questioned, the guard muttered, "He said it was for what I did to Hennessy." The name Hennessy does not appear in the prison's formal logs. More recently, during the early 2000s, a correctional officer on night patrol claimed to see a figure walking through the exercise yard during a lockdown. Dressed in outdated prison garb, the figure did not respond to commands or warnings. When the officer approached, he passed directly through the figure, into a wall. Security footage from that night showed nothing, but the officer's heart rate monitor, part of standard equipment at the time, spiked sharply at exactly 3:05 a.m. Paranormal investigators granted brief access to the older, disused wings of the jail have documented temperature drops, untraceable voices, and recordings of the phrase "he sees" repeated over and over in a low, rasping whisper. The source remains unknown. Yet the ghost of Retribution is not the only story Goulburn jail has to tell.
In the old chapel, now used for storage, staff report doors slamming shut without cause. The air within is thick, musty, and carries a scent that some describe as copper and fire. A former inmate, interviewed under condition of anonymity, claimed he once heard Latin chanting from the walls. There was no priest, just the echo. "I don't even know Latin," he said, visibly shaken. Inmates in solitary confinement sometimes report the feeling of someone sitting on their bed. One man refused to re-enter his cell after being released for a shower. "He talks to me when the lights go out," he said. "He knows what I did." Even the building's design seems to encourage fear. The central panopticon tower, designed to allow a single guard to observe multiple wings simultaneously, is rumored to be the epicenter of paranormal activity. Staff working late shifts often describe feeling as though they're being watched from the tower, even when it's empty. And then there's Supermax. Built adjacent to the original facility in the year 2001, the High-Risk Management Correctional Center, or Supermax, houses some of the most dangerous inmates in the country. Designed for sensory deprivation and complete isolation, it is supposed to be impenetrable by distraction or outside influence. And yet, newer officers stationed at Supermax have begun whispering about the blackout hour, a phenomenon where cell cameras fail, lights flicker, and a sense of dread fills the air between 2 and 3 a.m. Some guards have requested transfers. Others won't speak on record. One left a single sentence on his resignation form. He's not a prisoner, but he walks among them. What makes Goulburn's ghost stories so disturbing is how often they are tied to justice, or the lack of it. The ghost of Retribution is said not to harm the innocent, only those who abuse power, who take pleasure in cruelty, or who commit acts of cowardice behind locked doors. It is vengeance without trial, a final sentence delivered in shadow. Today, Goulburn continues to operate, with the original jail partially converted into a museum and heritage site. But the staff, both old and new, know that the building's history is more than stone and steel. They speak of the chill in certain corridors, the silence that feels like listening, the feeling of a gaze that weighs more than any man's. So if you find yourself near Goulburn Jail, whether on a tour or just passing by, take a moment to look up at the tower. You might see nothing, or you might see him, the one who still watches, the one who comes only for those who deserve it.
The Shadows of Ross Female Factory. Nestled quietly in the rolling green hills of central Tasmania, the small colonial town of Ross exudes a charming storybook beauty. Cobblestone streets wind past sandstone cottages, and the air carries the gentle scent of eucalyptus and old wood smoke. But just beyond this postcard-perfect facade lies a place where innocence ended, where the dreams of the forgotten were ground to dust. The Ross Female Factory, one of only a handful of such institutions in Australia, is no grand structure of iron and stone, but its legacy is as haunted as any towering jail. And the shadows that linger there, they belong to women whose voices were never meant to be heard again. Established in the year 1847 and in operation until 1854, the Ross Female Factory was one of 4 designated sites in Van Diemen's Land for the containment and correction of female convicts. It was not a prison in the conventional sense, not at first. Rather, it was a staging ground, a place where women were sent while awaiting assignment as domestic servants or as punishment for minor infractions. But make no mistake, life within its walls was cold, harsh, and brutally indifferent. The factory housed as many as 200 women at a time, many with infants at their breasts or toddlers at their sides. They slept on straw mattresses in overcrowded cells, worked long hours in laundries and kitchens, and faced constant surveillance and moral judgment. For the women of Ross, crime was rarely what led them there. More often, it was poverty, survival, or resistance to authority, crimes of the desperate. And desperation, as the history of the Ross Female Factory shows, often leads to tragedy. One of the most heart-wrenching aspects of life at the factory was the nursery ward. Designed to house the infants of convicts until they could be weaned or placed elsewhere, the nursery became a chamber of sorrow. Records show that many children did not survive, lost to malnutrition, illness, or neglect. The cries of those children, they say, have never stopped. Visitors to the site today often report hearing them. Faint, high-pitched wails on the wind, especially near the foundation stones where the nursery once stood. Several tourists have described the sensation of being followed by a small hand clutching their coat. One woman claimed she turned to see a child, barefoot and pale, reach up to her and vanish in the blink of an eye. The spirits at Ross are not confined to children. The women who lived, labored, and died here are said to walk the ground still. The most commonly cited apparition is known locally as the washerwoman. Dressed in a faded shift, her sleeves rolled, she appears near the ruins of the old laundry, scrubbing at invisible linens in a stone basin long since crumbled. She does not respond to speech, but will sometimes turn to face onlookers, her face wet, not with water, but with tears. Some say she is the ghost of Bridget Connolly, an Irish woman sentenced to 7 years for stealing fabric. Historical records show that Bridget gave birth in the factory and lost the child weeks later to fever. She died soon after. Whether the washerwoman is Bridget or not, her grief is palpable. Those who witness her often report a sense of helplessness, as though sharing in a pain that has no words. The matron's quarters, once the seat of authority within the factory, are another focus of strange occurrences. Though largely reconstructed for tourism, the original stonework remains beneath the floorboards. Staff have spoken of doors creaking open by themselves, the smell of soap and ash wafting through closed rooms, and the sound of heavy skirts brushing the floor. One interpreter, locking up for the evening, heard a stern voice call her by name from an empty hallway. She did not return to work for several weeks.
Perhaps the most unsettling phenomena occurred during twilight, a time the locals have come to call the gathering. It's during these hours that figures begin to appear near the stone walls, their forms vague at first, like mist catching the dying light. Over time, the outlines sharpen. Women in smocks, some carrying bundles, others standing with arms crossed. They do not move, they do not speak, but they watch. Tourists have captured these forms in photographs, often as clusters of semi-transparent shapes, distinctly human in posture and proportion. In one particularly striking image, 3 figures stand in a perfect row against the wall of the solitary cells, where women were confined for speaking out or refusing orders. The figures appear to be holding hands. But the Ross female factory's deepest scar lies underground. Behind the main yard, partially obscured by weeds and native grass, is a burial site. Officially, it holds a handful of marked graves, but historians believe many more lie beneath the soil. Unnamed women and infants buried without ceremony, without stone, without memory. The ground here is said to be especially active. EMF readers spike wildly. Batteries drain in minutes. Some visitors report intense emotional reactions, crying, shaking, sudden panic, often without knowing why. One woman, a retired nurse on holiday, reported feeling as though her chest was being crushed as she stood near the old laundry wall. She heard a voice, soft but clear, whisper, "Don't take him." She had no context for the message, but later read about the forced removal of children from female convicts during the factory's operation. Local indigenous custodians have also spoken about the land, not only as a site of colonial trauma, but as a place where spiritual disquiet persists. Some warn against visiting at night, not because of danger, but out of respect. "The spirits there are not angry," one elder said, "but they remember." The Ross Female Factory is now part of the Australian Convict Sites World Heritage Listing, and its ruins are visited by thousands each year. But unlike the towering jails of Port Arthur or Fremantle, its haunted legacy is quieter, more intimate. It speaks not of violence alone, but of sorrow, loss, and voices stifled for generations. So if you ever find yourself in the shadow of those crumbling stone walls, stop, breathe, and if you hear a lullaby on the wind, or feel a tear that is not your own, you're not imagining it. You've simply stepped into someone else's memory, one that never left.
The Hangman's Haunt at Hobart Jail. Hidden among the winding streets of Tasmania's capital, nestled behind the solemn facades of colonial-era sandstone, lies a place where final breaths were taken and justice was measured by the turn of a rope. Hobart Jail, also known as the Campbell Street Jail, is one of the oldest penal sites in Australia. Though much of the original complex has been swallowed by urban development, fragments remain, haunted not only by their stone and shadow, but by a name whispered in dread, the Hangman. The Hobart Jail operated from the early 1820s until its closure in the year 1963. In that time, it bore witness to brutal floggings, cruel confinement, and the executions of more than 30 inmates. It was a place of thick walls and thicker silence, where condemned men carved their names into cell doors, and prisoners paced in the dark, counting the days until their name appeared on the gallows ledger. The execution yard remains intact, a narrow claustrophobic space walled in on all sides by weathered sandstone. It was here, beneath the open sky, that the condemned stood, bound, masked, and trembling. Many never confessed. Some screamed their innocence until the drop silenced them forever, and it is here, in this yard, where the stories begin. The Hangman, known in historical records as Solomon Blay, was Tasmania's longest-serving executioner, performing more than 100 hangings across a career that spanned from the mid-1840s to the late 1880s. Despised by the public and prisoners alike, Blay was shunned in life. No one would sit beside him on public transport. Children crossed the road to avoid him. His very presence was said to chill the air. He died penniless, buried in an unmarked grave, his name mostly forgotten by the living. But according to many, Solomon Blay never left. The Hangman's ghost is one of the most consistently reported entities at Hobart Jail. Witnesses describe a tall, gaunt figure clad in dark Victorian garb, often appearing near the gallows or descending the narrow stairwell to the condemned cells. Tour guides have seen him watching silently from behind iron bars, only to vanish when approached. A former staff member, locking up after a twilight tour, saw a man standing beside the gallows platform. When she asked if he was lost, he turned, revealing a face twisted into a sneer, and disappeared into smoke. Guests often report sudden chills in the yard, even on warm days. Some say they feel a noose tightening around their necks, a fleeting constriction, gone in seconds but impossible to forget. One visitor claimed he saw his own breath in the air, despite the temperature being well above 20 degrees. But the hangman is not the only spirit bound to this place. The condemned cells, cold, featureless rooms just meters from the gallows, exude a despair that is difficult to describe. Some have likened the atmosphere to being underwater, as if sound and breath are muted. One particularly active cell, believed to have held multiple condemned men in its time, often produces unexplained knocking sounds, soft sobbing, and, on rare occasions, a single word whispered through the silence: help. A visitor on a guided tour once collapsed in that very cell. When revived, he claimed he had seen a man tied to the wall, bleeding, looking right through me. No such display exists on site. The cell has no mannequins. His account matched details from a forgotten execution record, later uncovered by a local historian. Upstairs, the courtroom remains eerily intact, the wooden bench still polished, the dock still standing, and the walls still absorbing the weight of verdicts long past. It is here that fate was sealed with a gavel's rap. Tourists and staff alike have reported strange audio anomalies, voices recorded when no one is speaking, whispers picked up on mobile phones, and the occasional loud bang with no discernible source. One story tells of a barrister who once visited the site after hours. Alone in the courtroom, he took a seat in the gallery for a moment of reflection. Minutes later, he felt someone sit beside him. He turned, expecting a colleague, but saw only the indentation in the bench where no one sat. The hairs on his arms stood up. Then a voice spoke, low and bitter. "Tell them I didn't do it." The jail's chapel, converted from one of the older blocks, holds its own secrets. A place of final solace, it saw countless condemned men kneel in prayer before meeting their fate. It is in this room that guests have reported the feeling of hands pressed to their shoulders in reassurance or restraint. One woman described the sensation as a blessing turned warning. Another said she saw a flicker of candlelight, though no candles were present. But the most compelling account of paranormal activity comes from a retired prison guard who worked at the jail in the 1950s. In a recorded interview, he described waking in the middle of the night, years after retiring, to see the hangman standing at the foot of his bed, silent, watching, and slowly shaking his head. The guard had witnessed several executions himself. "It wasn't guilt I felt," he said. "It was a reckoning." To this day, Hobart Jail conducts ghost tours through the preserved wings of the prison. Tourists are advised to stay with the group, especially in the execution yard and condemned cells. Staff no longer brush off reports of sightings. They log them, quietly, discreetly, knowing full well that the jail's history is not confined to books and photographs. It breathes through the walls. And if you stand beneath the gallows at dusk, listen closely. The creak of wood, the rasp of rope, and somewhere nearby, the hangman watching still. Not with cruelty, but with purpose. After all, he was merely doing his job. But who will now hang the dead? The old Dubbo jail apparitions. In the heart of regional New South Wales, where modern cafes and traffic signals hum with daily life, stands a relic that does not move with time. The old Dubbo jail, nestled within the bustling township of Dubbo, is one of the most thoroughly preserved examples of 19th century incarceration in Australia. It is a compact prison, modest in scale, yet immense in atmosphere. Every corridor, every cell, every iron-barred window seems to whisper the same message. We remember. Operating from the year 1847 until its official closure in the year 1966, Dubbo Jail bore witness to a spectrum of human experience, from the petty to the violent, the remorseful to the damned. Its sandstone walls once held bushrangers, murderers, the mentally unwell, and youths who had fallen through society's cracks. And though its gates have long since opened to the public as a museum and heritage site, something, or several things, remain behind, unwilling or unable to leave. The most widely reported paranormal activity centers around Cell 11. This unassuming stone room has developed a reputation as the most active site in the entire compound. Visitors report an overwhelming sense of dread upon crossing the threshold. Some leave in tears, others with nausea or splitting headaches. One local historian, known for his skepticism, walked into Cell 11 during a routine inspection and promptly collapsed, unconscious for several minutes. When revived, he described hearing a man choking to death, but no one was there. Historical records confirm that a prisoner once died by suicide in Cell 11, hanging himself from the barred window during a winter night in the 1880s. Since then, multiple visitors and staff have claimed to see a figure slumped in the corner, only for it to vanish when approached. But not all spirits at Dubbo Jail are so elusive. One of the most frequently seen apparitions is that of a tall male in prison garb, often observed pacing the upper walkway above the cell block. This walkway, accessible only by a narrow staircase, is cordoned off during tours. And yet, time and again, tourists report seeing someone up there, walking slowly, arms behind his back, head bowed. When guards go to investigate, the walkway is empty. This figure is believed by some to be the spirit of Frederick Ward, better known as the bushranger Captain Thunderbolt. While there is no historical record of Ward being incarcerated at Dubbo, local legend suggests he may have passed through briefly during his days on the run. Others argue the figure is one of the 11 men executed at the jail, whose identities, though documented, have blurred into myth over time. Speaking of executions, Dubbo Jail's gallows are still standing, and still potent.
Visitors often describe an uncanny chill in the execution yard, one that seems to settle in the bones regardless of the weather. The trapdoor remains in place, and while the mechanism no longer functions, the heavy timber and iron hardware cast long, ominous shadows on the yard's perimeter. It is said that on certain nights, long after the last tour has ended, the sound of wood groaning under weight can be heard, followed by a sharp thud that echoes through the yard. Several staff have sworn never to enter the gallows alone after dark. One night guard in the 1990s quit after witnessing a rope swinging violently, though the air was still. "I wasn't alone," he later told a local reporter, "and I was supposed to be." Inside the administrative wing, once home to the jailer's office and records room, another spirit makes its presence known, though not through sight or sound. It is olfactory, the strong, sudden scent of tobacco and pipe smoke. Several guests have commented on the smell, asking who was smoking in the building, only to be told that smoking has been banned for decades. In one notable case, a school teacher chaperoning a group of students was overtaken by the smell and fled the room, convinced she'd seen a man exhaling smoke near the record shelves. No one else saw him. One of the more unsettling legends of the old Dubbo Jail involves the so-called warden who waits. Described as an older man in uniform with a stiff gait and a disapproving frown, this spirit is often seen near the main entrance to the exercise yard, standing with arms crossed. He reportedly appears just before something unusual happens: a power failure, an audio malfunction, or a guest feeling faint. Some paranormal researchers believe this entity is protective, a remnant of one of the jail's long-serving wardens who has remained to keep order. Others suggest he's a judge of sorts, silently weighing the guilt of those who pass. Children in particular seem sensitive to the warden's presence. One boy, part of a primary school excursion, burst into tears when walking past the yard's threshold. When asked what was wrong, he pointed and said, "The angry man doesn't want me here." There was no one in sight. The infirmary, tucked away in a quieter section of the compound, has its own tales to tell. The room, now sparse and filled with replicas of medical tools, retains an eerie stillness. Visitors sometimes hear coughing, groaning, or the rustling of bed sheets, even when alone. One tour guide reported a guest who sat on the hospital bed and suddenly bolted up, swearing she felt something breathing on the back of her neck. Dubbo locals speak of the jail with reverence, caution, and no small amount of pride. It is a cornerstone of the town's history, a museum of colonial justice, and a window into the darker corners of Australia's past. But for some, it is also something more, a place where time does not move in straight lines and where those with unfinished stories still linger. Today, the jail offers educational programs, cultural tours, and even night experiences for those brave enough to walk its halls by torchlight. But guides are careful to set expectations. Not everyone sees something, but those who do never forget. So if you visit the old Dubbo jail and a door slams behind you with no wind, or you hear faint footsteps trailing your own, or the noose above the gallows sways just slightly while the air lies still, you are not alone. And perhaps, for just a moment, someone, prisoner or warden, has returned to walk beside you.
J Ward Ararat's Echoes of Madness. High in the Grampians region of Victoria, where rolling hills give way to valleys brushed by mist, sits a brooding sandstone structure that defies time and reason. Ararat's J Ward, a towering remnant of Australia's complex history of punishment and mental health, was once a jail, then an asylum for the criminally insane. Today, it is a museum of memory and madness, where the echoes of suffering linger long after the last doors were locked, and those who visit swear that some echoes still speak back. Originally built as the Ararat Jail in the year 1859, the facility housed common criminals until the year 1887. Then, in a quiet yet sinister administrative move, it was repurposed into a wing of the Ararat Lunatic Asylum, designated for the criminally insane. From that moment on, J Ward ceased to be a prison and became a purgatory. Its inmates were men who had committed murder, arson, and unspeakable violence, often deemed too dangerous or too unwell for standard incarceration. They were not simply locked up. They were observed, medicated, and in many cases, forgotten. And J Ward never forgot them. To enter the grounds is to step into a place where the walls seem to breathe. High, unyielding, and aged by decades of wind and grief, the stone exterior gives way to narrow corridors, flaking paint, and a silence so complete it hums. Guides speak softly. Visitors tread lightly. Because in J Ward, madness lingers like smoke. The most active room in the facility is the former governor's office. Once a space of authority and paperwork, it is now a chamber of unexplained cold. Thermometers regularly drop to near freezing within the room, regardless of season. One tour group reported seeing frost form on the windows during the height of a summer's day. A former caretaker swore he saw a figure in a dark coat seated at the desk, tapping a pen against paper, only to vanish as he entered the room. The pen was still warm. But the most disturbing energies are found in the cells. One of the smallest cells in the block, known simply as the cage, is believed to have held a man who murdered 3 members of his family before descending into catatonia. He was reportedly nonverbal for the final 2 decades of his confinement. Yet guests in that cell often hear breathing, growling, and, most disturbingly, whispering. The whispers are too soft to decipher, but their intent feels unmistakable. You are not welcome. During a night tour in the early 2000s, a skeptical visitor laughed while standing in the cage. Moments later, he collapsed, suffering a sudden seizure. He had no history of medical conditions. When paramedics arrived, he whispered, "Don't let him in." He refused to elaborate.
Another well-documented spirit is known as Old Bill, believed to be the ghost of a long-term inmate who spent over 40 years within J Ward's walls. Bill reportedly died peacefully in his bed, but never left. Multiple visitors report the scent of tobacco and the feeling of being watched in the East Wing, where Bill's room remains untouched. Some claim to see a shape seated on the bed. One guide found the covers pulled back neatly, as though someone had just stepped out, though no one had entered the wing that day. The asylum's shower block carries a different kind of weight. Once a place of forced hygiene and humiliation, the tiled chamber is now known for sudden temperature changes and wet footprints appearing on dry floors. One nurse, decades ago, refused to enter after claiming to hear screams whenever the taps were turned. Those taps, of course, are no longer connected to running water, yet on rare occasions, guests report hearing them drip, drip, drip. The dining hall offers no relief. Its long tables and benches remain eerily in place, set up as though waiting for the next meal. But those who sit often feel a presence loom behind them, heavy, cold, disapproving. Some have turned to see a tall man in a hospital gown, mouth agape as if mid-scream, standing just behind their shoulder. But perhaps the most terrifying area is the underground morgue. Located beneath the main building, this cold, stone-walled room once held the dead until their bodies could be buried or claimed, which was rare. Many inmates were interred in unmarked graves in the yard behind the ward. Visitors to the morgue report hearing the clatter of surgical tools, despite the cabinets being long emptied. Others describe the smell of antiseptic mixed with decay. One guide felt something brush against his ankle, soft, like fingers. He did not return to the site for several months. In a darkened display case in the hallway outside the morgue sits a collection of personal items, combs, dentures, glasses, once belonging to the inmates. They are ordinary objects, but guests often report a wave of nausea or sorrow while viewing them. One woman said she heard a voice whisper, "Mine," when she leaned close to the glass. Even the staff are not immune. One long-serving tour leader, known for her no-nonsense attitude, admitted to being followed home on more than one occasion. "I'd see him in the mirror," she said, "just for a second, a face behind mine, then gone." She never described the face in detail, but eventually stopped leading tours at night. Today, J Ward is a museum. Its exhibits are dedicated to mental health history, the penal system, and the lives of the men once confined within. But the past is not dead here. It prowls the corridors, waits in doorways, and watches from corners. And above all, it remembers. So if you visit J Ward Ararat and find yourself standing in the dark, heart pounding, breath shallow, remember this: it is not always the mad who haunt the sane. Sometimes it's the other way around.
Ripples from the Underground, Australia's prisons today. Across Australia, the towering sandstone walls and creaking iron gates of the colonial prison era may have fallen quiet, but the spirit of incarceration and the echoes of the past still ripple through the modern system. The penitentiaries we know today, outfitted with biometric scanners, electronic surveillance, and fluorescent sterility, might seem a world away from the haunted blocks of Port Arthur, the gallows of Hobart, or the madness of J Ward. Yet speak to the men and women who walk those corridors, inmates and officers alike, and you'll hear it. The past isn't dead. It's just wearing a different uniform. Australia's present-day prison system is vast and complex, holding over 40,000 individuals across dozens of correctional facilities. Some are high-tech strongholds like Goulburn Supermax or the Ravenhall Correctional Centre in Victoria. Others are more traditional, regional institutions, echoing the layouts and philosophies of earlier centuries. But no matter how sleek or modern the exterior, the energies inside, pain, guilt, regret, and fear, are timeless. And in some places, they manifest. Take Grafton Correctional Centre, for example. Though the old prison closed in the year 2012 and operations shifted to a new, modern facility in Levadia, stories persist of unexplained phenomena lingering in the original sandstone building. Guards performing final walkthroughs before decommissioning reported doors opening on their own, radios switching frequencies mid-conversation, and a distinct tapping sound echoing in empty cell blocks. One officer, reluctant to speak publicly, confessed, "It felt like the walls were disappointed in us for leaving. Even in new facilities, there are murmurs." At the recently opened Clarence Correctional Center, a gleaming high-security compound touted for its state-of-the-art rehabilitation programs, strange experiences have already crept into the conversation. In the solitary unit, several inmates have independently complained of voices whispering in the night. These voices, they say, don't speak in English. One prisoner described them as, like old-world murmuring, like someone praying in a language I don't know. The administration attributes this to isolation-induced hallucination, but seasoned officers, many of whom previously worked at older institutions, aren't so sure. "It's the land," one said. "You can build new walls, but you can't clear the past off the soil. And what of Fremantle's ghosts, or the Whistler of Maitland? Some spirits, it seems, follow not places, but patterns." Reports have emerged from Lithgow Correctional Center of an unexplained whistle echoing through the halls at night, a drawn-out, tuneless note that stops conversation cold. Officers have searched vents, camera blind spots, even conducted sound mapping. Nothing. One senior officer quipped, "It's as if someone brought it with them." These tales raise questions that few in official positions are keen to explore. Can trauma attach itself to people? Can institutions themselves absorb and carry a psychic weight across generations? If a prisoner dies in despair and another enters the same system with the same suffering, do they inherit more than just a cell number?
Correctional psychologists are divided. Some believe that shared hallucination, the psychological imprint of place, explains these stories. Others argue that collective memory plays a role. If a site has a reputation, then fear will do the rest. But among former inmates, the language is different. They don't talk about atmosphere or mental suggestion. They talk about being watched, about seeing shapes in the corner of their eyes, about hearing their names whispered at 3 a.m. when no one else is awake. One former prisoner from Barwon Prison, now an artist and public speaker, recounted his first week in isolation. "The lights were always on. I was alone. But someone kept knocking, slow, deliberate knocks. I asked the guards. They said it wasn't them. One of them finally said, 'Just tell it to stop. It usually does after a few nights.'" But these experiences aren't confined to high-security wings. Even in juvenile detention centres, strange incidents emerge. A youth worker in Queensland described a series of electrical malfunctions that always occurred in one particular unit. Doors refusing to unlock, lights flickering, sudden power outages. Technicians found no faults. The young inmates began refusing to sleep in the room, claiming a man stood over them, whispering about punishment. Whether these accounts stem from spirits of the dead, the psychic scars of punishment, or something else entirely, one fact remains clear. Australia's correctional institutions, old and new, continue to carry the weight of their history. The colonial-era prisons were built to silence and subdue, but now those very walls, or the legacy of them, seem to be speaking back. And maybe it's not just ghosts we're hearing. Maybe it's a warning. because in every corridor that echoes with unseen footsteps, in every cold breath that dances down a sealed hallway, in every voice that speaks when no mouth moves, there is a message. The system remembers, and so do those it forgot. So if you find yourself working late at a correctional facility, turning keys down a sterile hall, or glancing at the camera feed that blurs for no reason, listen. The past may not be dead. It may just be doing time, like everyone else.
Thank you for walking with us through the iron corridors, echoing gallows, and silent shadows of Australia's most haunted prisons. From the lingering sorrow of Ross to the chilling footsteps of Fremantle, each site carries more than just history. It carries memory. Memory etched in stone, sealed behind cell doors, and whispered through the cold night air. If these stories stirred something in you, if you felt a chill, heard a breath, or imagined footsteps just behind your own, then perhaps, just perhaps, you've brushed against the edge of what still lingers. Before you drift off to sleep, we ask you kindly, like this video, subscribe to our channel, and join us again soon for another journey into the forgotten, the eerie, and the unseen. It helps us bring more tales like this to life, and it keeps the stories from falling silent. Sleep well, and remember, some walls remember everything. Good night.